So for this oral exam, we'll be exploring the question, rather two questions around what makes the entrepreneurial process different from conventional managerial thinking, and then also how has this course and the visit to Chicago changed my personal view of business and my approach to problem solving. So beginning first with the first question around how the entrepreneurial process differs from conventional managerial thinking. I think it's important that we define how managerial thinking acts and kind of how it works in the business context. Saras D. Saravathi wrote a very compelling piece around this topic, actually, and the author defined conventional managerial thinking as thinking that is causal or predictive. So you have a set of information and you're looking to optimize the outcome per a few different variables. So to make it real, you're working with Solver, you know the cost of your inputs, and you're looking to find the output or the equation that gives you the greatest number of profits, or a simple variable make versus buy. This problem-solving process is kind of delineated per the textbook example, in which you start by defining the market, then you segment that market, then you begin targeting various markets, and then you develop the positioning needed to reach the customer. Second, this same line of thinking and philosophy focuses on competitive analyses. So you're trying to identify in the existing market how your product would interplay with some of the other competitive offerings, and then try to predict what those competitive responses would be. It focuses and is dependent on exploiting pre-existing knowledge and using the tools of prediction to strike powerful business outcomes. And generally, they see kind of like the cross of exploring a new market with a new product to be the suicide quadrant, which strikes very differently from how the traditional entrepreneur might approach the same process. In fact, the entrepreneur would think about that very differently, as there are quite a few different attributes that contribute to the entrepreneurial process that delineates that same process from conventional managerial thinking. And that same author termed this philosophy to be effectual reasoning. And effectual reasoning, when it comes to solving a problem, begins slightly differently. So it'll look at defining one of several possible markets, and then adding segments and strategic partners before defining the customer and identifying the customer, before then eventually serving the customer with a product or service. The entrepreneur will then also approach structuring the business around three core principles that the conventional manager in a business context would not. So beginning first with the affordable loss principle, it's the idea that rather than trying to maximize the outcome, so maximizing the profits that your business can achieve, you're looking to minimize the resources that you're expending in order to get to the market or to serve the customer. And this is a topic that we explored fairly early on in class around with the idea of prototyping your service. So something that I found fairly interesting with one of these food waste reduction startups was the idea of going to your potential customers, or rather the partners that would be serving your customers, with a tip jar, and just saying, would customers put money in the tip jar in order to then sponsor meals for homeless citizens on Franklin Street? This would be a very low cost, easy, quick, and effective way of kind of validating the market. A second principle would be around the strategic partnerships. So a larger state or larger or more mature business might look to kind of start building their customer base first, and then starting to tack on partnerships if they found that necessary, whereas the entrepreneur would approach it very, very differently. Instead, they would try to obtain pre-commitments from key stakeholders to reduce the uncertainty in the early stages of opening an enterprise. So a good way of de-risking your enterprise for a variety of different stakeholders. So one, it builds a much more compelling value proposition when you're going to market and trying to pitch to customers to choose your business. Second, when you're looking to then kind of accept to then deploy capital, you'll have a much stronger value proposition and less risky investment to some of these venture capital investors. Finally, the third principle, the idea of leveraging contingencies, is one that I think is the largest differentiator between entrepreneurs and conventional managers in their line of thinking. So the conventional manager would probably follow the metaphor of ready, aim, 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 fire. So they'll be looking to develop all the marketing research, begin validating some of these hypotheses, and then finally going to market with this perfect idea or product, and just assuming that that the market will like it. Whereas the entrepreneur would try to iterate a little bit more quickly, taking the product to market even if they don't think they might be ready, and then learning from the outcomes. And a great example of that mentality or that kind of business process would be Airbnb. We read the Harvard Business Review case on the two founders and discussed, what was then Air Bed and Breakfast, how to kind of improve some of their business outcomes and how they were kind of able to iterate on their business per feedback from the market. So when they first began Airbnb, they noticed that their business was super cyclical and highly dependent on events and conferences. So in order to better understand how they could kind of get away from that, they actually flew to New York to speak with the hosts and the users to understand, what were some of the hiccups that Airbnb was having and how could they solve for that and improve their business model so that they could kind of achieve a sustainable competitive business advantage. And finally, one piece around entrepreneurship that I found to be very compelling, and one idea that we've explored throughout this course and throughout the Chicago Ideas Week is the idea that you need to have the right people in place. So a good quote from Saraswati Sarasvathy was that to the extent that we can control the future, we do not need to predict it. And your ability to control the future is highly people dependent. So you need to make sure that you're bringing the right people into your organization. So as Eric Becker and Larry Levy would say, these are the nice guys, the people who want to do right by you, want to do right by your organization. And ultimately, these last few weeks and the visit to Chicago Ideas Week has kind of impressed upon me the power of effectual reasoning, the power of the entrepreneurial process, and has ultimately changed how I kind of think about business and also my own approach to problem solving. With regard to my view of business, I took away two key lessons. So the first would be the idea of ready, fire, aim, as I've always been that person who thought that with the perfect amount of market research and some really smart people in the room, that you could kind of predict the outcome, plan for it, and then move your organization in that direction. I now no longer feel that that's necessarily the best course of outcome. I think you want to be fast, you want to be agile, you want to be able to move quickly in the market. And the second piece would be around having the right people around you. And per Eric's LinkedIn post, people is the biggest driving force as to why he chose to work for Spring CM. And even if I were to join a larger organization, I've realized that I can borrow entrepreneurial concepts. So, for example, in Peter Diamandis' book Bold, they created these skunk work type functions in which they were free of bureaucracy. They had this one goal, and they were just able to stay in a flow state longer because they just were not in a disruptive environment. And I want to structure my problem-solving abilities and my future business aspirations around that same piece. So from how I approach problem-solving, I'm definitely thinking about it at a much higher level, thinking big picture. How can I define the problem, then create a solution, rather than trying to force-fit a solution to a problem and address these imaginary pain points. Due to the introduction personally to design thinking and systems thinking in this course, I would like to try and borrow some of those concepts going forward and trying to address some of these larger problems in my career, and ultimately looking to de-risk any of the ventures that I start, as I think that might be the biggest inhibitor or problem that I'm trying to solve if I were to become an entrepreneur.